Atheist Alliance International podcast.
I don't make this stuff up.
You know, if you put Jesus Christ first, that he'll look after all your bills.
It's not fake, it's faith.
Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the Atheist Alliance International podcast. I'm your host, Jason. Joining me today is Adam Elmasri, who is a former Coptic Christian and an Egyptian who now lives in the safety of Australia, where he can be an atheist. So Adam, welcome and thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Jason. Thank you for having me.
So maybe just give us a quick introduction to who you are and what you're up to, so our viewers can get a sense of what you're up to.
Well, I'm an Egyptian-Australian author, activist, YouTuber, came from a Coptic Christian background. I do have a couple of YouTube channels now, and I speak openly about the freedom of disbelief, the rights of women, the rights of LGBT community, predominantly in the Middle East, but in the last couple of years, I extended my work to be in the Western world, speaking in English as well. So, yeah.
Well, all right. And when did you become an atheist?
Well, until today, I openly declare myself agnostic.
Okay.
It really depends who I talk to. Sometimes I say I'm an agnostic atheist. Sometimes I say I'm an agnostic deist, basically just to avoid the ridiculous arguments of does God exist or not. As far as I am concerned, I speak against religion. So even if God exists, I'm not interested in that part. I'm interested that this God never sent prophets or books or whatever, is not interested in the human affairs. So to skip that question, I openly declare myself as agnostic deist. Even if I believe in a God, then let's take it from here. Realistically, I'm an agnostic atheist, I would say.
And so when
Sorry.
did you become one? When did you, because I'm assuming at some point you were a practicing Coptic Christian at some point in your life.
Absolutely, until very recently, actually.
Okay. All right.
I was practicing. I was entrenched in the church until maybe 10 years ago, roughly.
Okay. So when you
19
say
years ago.
entrenched, like were you were actively involved in the ministry of the church, or you were like a lay sort of pastor, or what? So how were you entrenched?
I was a deacon, an altar boy, a Sunday school teacher. I was an active member in the choir. I played music in the choir. My entire social circle basically was in the church. I knew nearly no life outside of the church. And that even in Egypt, of course, but even when I came to Australia, that was my first few years in Australia. I was still practicing Christian and I was doing all these things.
Okay. So you didn't leave Egypt to go to Australia because you would become an atheist. So you were still a Christian when you went to Australia. Okay.
Absolutely.
So
Yeah.
that's okay. So I wasn't sure if that was part of your journey, was going to Australia was a safety feature, but okay. All right. So you're in this community. So I did a little research before. So according to Wikipedia, the Coptic Christians are about 10 million strong in Egypt, which is about 10% of the population. Would you concur that you're about 10%?
I would say we're probably more. We're more like 15-17%.
Okay. All right. So as I mentioned just before we started the show, I've never actually talked to a Coptic Christian before. So this is a new experience for me. So what is it like to be a Christian minority in a Muslim majority country? Historically, right? I mean, the Christians were there first, and then Muhammad comes along, and I took an Islamic history elective in university, and from what I remember of my Islamic history, when Muhammad was first getting started and he's being persecuted, I believe he found sanctuary at a Christian monastery in Egypt. And you maybe know that history better than I do. And that's why the Christians and the monasteries that are still in Egypt, they're essentially protected, because Muhammad said, hey, these people gave me shelter, they're not to be touched. So is that fairly accurate from what you know of Coptic Christianity?
I am honestly unaware of that story. As far as I know,
Okay.
Muhammad never visited Egypt or went to Egypt. Islam came to Egypt with what's his name? Yeah, so
the
later,
Ram.
I think Ali ibn Abi Talib, I think, is the one. Don't quote me on this. I don't really
Yeah,
exactly remember the name, but it wasn't Muhammad who came to Egypt. It was later successors that came
yeah,
and spread Islam into Egypt. And of course, you get two different narratives. You will get the church history narrative from the Coptic perspective, that we were persecuted, we suffered a lot, um, we couldn't build any more churches and all that kind of discrimination sort of narrative. And then you get the Islamic picture of the history, which they were very tolerant. Christians accepted Islam, the Islamic conquest, I would say, with open arms, and they really were the basically Islam came to Egypt to release the Copts from the suppression of the Romans. So you get two completely different versions of history there.
right.
Modern history is a completely different story, of course.
Oh, obviously, yeah. Okay, so I don't know if it's accurate that it was a monastery in Egypt. It could have been a Christian monastery in Saudi Arabia, but what I remember of that story, this is like going back more than 30 years now, that he had sought sanctuary in a Christian monastery, and that's one of the reasons why he declares Muslims and Jews as the people of the book, and
Mm.
offers them protection because the Christian brothers had protected him. Now, I think it was a monastery in Egypt, but there are still, and from what I remember of my history, the monastic tradition started in Egypt. That actually started with Egyptian Christians. So, for the viewers who maybe not don't know, so Alexandria, the city that Constantine, that Alexander founded, Alexandria was the leading center of Christian scholarship in the early years. You have Origen is there, Clement is there. This is,
Athanasius. Yeah.
yeah, I think Athanasius, the bishop of Alexandria, who was like the main proponent of the Council of Nicaea. So you have this very, very strong Christian history in Alexandria in the early years. Um, so it's when the Arabs come in the 7th century, and as you say that the narratives change. But so what is it like today? I mean, is there discrimination for, like you said, it's about 15 to 17%. So what is life like for the everyday life for a Coptic Christian in Egypt?
Interesting question. It depends
Thank you.
um, who I'm talking as an Egyptian now, so I'm assuming that I'm a Coptic Christian living in Egypt today. One, it depends who I'm dealing with. Am I dealing with a random stranger on the street, or am I dealing with a government official, for instance? Who you're dealing with has a different level of discrimination. Let's clarify a couple of things first. Even when someone says there is no discrimination, there are elements there that you cannot deny. There is a, how do you say that? Okay, a couple of things. On your ID as an Egyptian, you have your religion on the ID card.
Okay.
So whenever you present your ID in any legal situation, a police officer asking for it, or you're trying to get some documents and you present your ID, you're always presenting your religion on the card. So even when people say, oh, well, there is no discrimination, well, prove it, because the person who's dealing with me is treating me based on the fact that I gave an ID card with my religion on it. So sometimes it's discrimination in disguise, and you cannot really prove it. I mean, being sent to the very back of the line just because they can't find your document, does that sound like discrimination? Being rejected for a job in the government because you don't qualify, really? Like, you can't really point it because, well, you don't qualify. But when you take the idea that your religion is on the ID, I think that says a lot. And even if you don't present your ID, in a lot of cases, your name says your religion, really. If your name is Muhammad Ali Mustafa, then you're a Muslim. If your name is Bulis, which is Paul, Girgis, which is George, all these kind of Christian names, then of course you're Christian. So sometimes your name will give it away, not necessarily the ID. Also, Coptic Christians, they do have this Coptic tattoo on their wrists.
Oh, I didn't know that.
All
Interesting.
right, so it's a very it's a declaration of faith, and you have these tattoos from as young as 9 years old, or even some kids 6 years old. They get tattooed. It has a story in the history, but in modern times, people do it just out of tradition and as a declaration of faith. So again, every time you hand money or you give something or you shake hands, your religion is on your arm. So all these things combined, you cannot really deny that there is some sort of a different treatment based on how you present yourself and your religion.
Okay, but it's more of like a soft bigotry. It's not like just outright discrimination. Like something like sending you to the back of the line, that kind of stuff. It's, they're not, it's not like South African apartheid. Where like you're being beaten in the streets and arrested and jailed on trumped up charges, that kind of stuff. It's more you're being denied jobs. The bureaucrats are kind of screwing you around to play games with you, that kind of thing.
That still happens. The attacks and the attacks on churches or on Christian individuals, it happens, but it happens as incidents and in certain suburbs or cities rather than every day and everywhere. I personally didn't experience physical violence in any way, but I definitely experienced those kind of things. Like I was rejected in a job, or I was failed a subject during uni years. I believe because of my religion.
Okay. So I presume then there's other, like there's teachers and bureaucrats, who don't care, right? They're just like, whatever, you're Christian, I don't care, and they, but you get the odd one who just wants to play games with you. So okay,
Yes.
yeah. I mean, I have heard that you mentioned. I do remember hearing of some fires that were set in the last few years. So okay, so presumably then this 15% of the population, these are holdouts for the last 1,500 years, right? Since the Arab conquest, they were Christians, during the Arab conquest, and they've stayed Christian for over 1,000 years. Like everybody else converted, but this core element, they've stayed true to their Christian beliefs. So it's
Absolutely.
kind of interesting that such a significant chunk of the population has stayed Christian for such a long time in such a predominantly Muslim cultures. Okay, interesting. All right. So you say you're an activist. So maybe talk a little bit about the activism that you do.
So what happened is, after I came to Australia, as we established, I didn't run away from Egypt for safety or anything like that. I was a Christian. I came to Australia as a Christian, and then eventually I had my own midlife crisis, if you want to call it. I had my own questions and doubts and read a lot, and then eventually I joined a very reputable Australian university, and I did a degree in biblical studies and textual criticism. By the end of that degree, that's when I openly declared myself agnostic, and I said I don't believe in everything I believed in before. When I started opening up, that impacted my social life. It resulted in a divorce. I was married at the time, and then that ended the marriage.
Sorry to
I
hear
had
that.
some Thank you. Well, that was again 10 years ago, so it's way past the pain now.
No, but I mean, but
I
still, that your choice would impact your marriage. I mean, like that's a sad state of affair that atheists are going through, especially if you're coming from a very strongly religious community like you did, where your whole identity is wrapped up in your church and your community. So to lose your wife, I mean, like that's a sad state of affairs that people are having to put up with. That it does ruin
Absolutely.
relationships and ends friendships. So I'm
Yeah,
sorry you had to go
absolutely.
through that.
And my best friend, who also lives in Australia, we came together from Egypt. So we're talking about a childhood friendship. We went to the same church, we went to the same school even, and we came to Australia together. That friend, when I told him that I don't believe in Jesus Christ anymore, he looked me in the eyes and said, "Well, I would like to maintain a distance from you, so please do not call me again." So yeah, you can see the impact of change of faith on the relationships. From there, of course, I went through some very dark experiences and dark times, and I went through psychotherapy, and it was a very awful couple of years until I regained confidence again in myself and my new set of beliefs and my worldviews, and I had a new set of friends and all that. And that's when it hit me. A lot of people go through this experience alone. And despite the fact that I was lucky having this experience in Australia, so I had access to psychologists, I had access to atheist groups and free thinkers. Most of the people in the Middle East, they cannot even open up or talk
Admit it.
about it, and they're completely isolated. So that was the very first seed for starting my Arabic YouTube channel years ago, which now is has over 15 million views and about 120,000 subscribers. It really grew beyond my expectations. I didn't even expect that when I started. I was just that guy who wanted to share his own experience and tell people that you're not alone. And because of my studies around biblical studies and textual criticism, I had enough tools and academic methods to apply to the Quran. So I started criticizing both Christianity and Islam equally, and all the discriminative aspects that come from there, like against women, against the LGBTQ communities, against those who leave the religion, the apostates, the blasphemy laws, all these things. So most of my activism is around these things. It has been for the majority of the last 10 years online as a YouTuber, but in the last 3 years, I authored my first book, which was in Arabic. I started giving lectures and speeches in universities and different channels. So I started expanding my work more outside of the online world.
Okay. So how many followers? Sorry, back up a little bit. So the videos you're doing on YouTube, they're deconstructions of the Bible and the Quran, or you're talking about other issues as well, like this is where you can go to get help, or do you just focus on the textual deconstructions?
Mostly textual deconstructions. Sometimes it's just talking about human rights and how this allegedly divine text can command you to do such atrocities, whether that is against women or against blasphemers or against apostates. Sometimes it's just philosophical and critical thinking arguments when two aspects of the theology or the belief really stand in contradiction with one another. What state of cognitive dissonance you experience in that? So it's a variety of themes. That I talk about. And again, when I started doing that work in English, I found that there is a huge lack in the textual criticism of Islam in the English spheres. You have a lot of people like Bart Ehrman and Seth Andrews and Matt Dillahunty and all these activists who really dissect the Bible and do the deconstruction from there. But I found that there's a huge lack for someone who came from an Arabic-speaking background to challenge the Quran and challenge the Hadith and Islamic principles. So my English activism took a slightly different, I wouldn't say different side, but it's slightly different focus due to the lack of that in the Western world.
Okay. Do you, I'm pretty sure Harris Sultan, like he lives in Australia too. Have you managed to connect with him? And
Absolutely.
maybe you've been on each other's shows? Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
You've been on his
I
show? He's
appeared
been
on
on
Harris
yours?
Sultan. Yes.
Okay.
No, he hasn't been on my channel yet, but I have been on Harris's show, and
Okay.
we connected and we talk occasionally every now and then, just outside, just as friends.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Okay. Yeah, he's been on this show about a year and a half ago, maybe. So
Yes.
he's been on our show before, and we want to have him on again, obviously, in the future. So, okay. So a question I've liked to ask other agnostics, as you say, in the past, especially people who've done the education that you have. Like we had Professor John Collins on from Yale University, who's an Old Testament scholar. And I asked him, said, like, what in your studies, like, what was the one thing in your studies that really surprised you? So I'll ask the same question to you. So coming from this very strong Coptic background and you're doing biblical studies and textual criticism, do you remember having a moment where like this a holy shit moment, like that's something that really smacked you in the face, that I can't believe this?
It wasn't one moment, to be honest. It was a succession of, like, it's a
Right.
series of moments. And I guess that the thing that I grew up with, especially being Egyptian, and you know so much about the Alexandrian theology, and how we were fed from a very young age to believe that everything we know is apostolic. Everything we are handed down all the way through the apostles of Jesus Christ. When I started my study, I realized that there are a lot of modifications and added on stories to the Bible and added verses, and that was a big shock to me. What do you mean added verses? What do you mean the ending of the Gospel of Mark wasn't there, the last 10 verses? What do you mean that the story of the woman who was
Taken adultery. It's not
found
there for the first
adultery?
1,000 years.
Exactly. Like
Yeah.
for 400, until the 4th century, this story wasn't in the Gospel of John. So things like this started making me like, hang on, I really put that document on a pedestal when it really isn't all that what I believed in. So that was a very big shock to me. But of course, there are a lot of other things
Yeah.
that were shocking.
So just a little bit of context for the viewers. So you mentioned that you're fed this apostolic narrative. So the Alexandrian Church is said to have been founded by Saint Mark, he of the Gospel of Mark, who was rumored to have been the scribe for Peter, the right hand of Jesus. So just that's the context of where the Coptic Church in Alexandria is supposedly founded by Mark. Just a little more context. So we have the major ecumenical council. So up until 451, where you have the Council of Chalcedon, then this is when the Coptic and the Syriac, they split off. They reject the Trinitarian formulation, the simultaneously divine and human nature of Jesus, formulated at the Council of Chalcedon, that is accepted by the Eastern Orthodox, by the Catholic Church, the Latin Church, and obviously by the later Protestants. But the what is known as the Oriental Orthodox churches, the Coptics, the Syriacs, they reject this formulation, and this is the first great schism of the church, where you now have the Oriental Orthodox and then you have everybody else. So this is the tradition of which the Coptic Church is rejecting Roman imperial Christianity, and this, and a lot of Christians don't know this, is that all of the councils were called by an emperor. Like Marcion called the Council of Chalcedon. There's a great quote from Dermot McCulloch, whose 2009 BBC series, A History of Christianity. He says, when the emperor calls a council, it always helps to have a few troops around to enforce orthodoxy, right? So you don't have this sense of like the Coptics and the Oriental Orthodox are seceding from Roman imperial Christianity, because it is very much Roman imperial. The emperors are calling the councils. They're deciding what is orthodoxy. So the Coptics and the others, they're separated out starting from 451. So just a little history there for people who maybe don't know the background of the Coptic Church and what it's about, where it comes from. Again, Mark founds it. So just a little
That's a
history.
great context.
So,
That's a great context,
yeah.
because it really, and this is perhaps one of the reasons why we think that we separated ourselves. Of course, we don't think that it's the emperors and the Romans. It's just we are the defenders of the faith. And Athanasius of Alexandria was the defender of the. He
Yeah.
wrote the creed, and it's such a.
Well, he was such a zealot, though. He was exiled 5 times by 4 different emperors, because he was such a pain in the ass about orthodoxy, right? Like he was just like, everybody hated him. Even Constantine censored the guy. So he was a character, that's for
You
sure.
know what's ironic, Jason? I'll tell you. When I finally became an atheist or agnostic, and I rejected the faith, I wanted to have another tattoo to embrace this new identity. And ironically, I couldn't find any other tattoo to represent my new phase other than Contramundum. I'm not sure if you can see it on my my arm here.
What is it?
Contramundum.
I don't speak Latin.
Right. Contramundum is a title that was attributed to Athanasius,
Okay.
who was known as Athanasius Contramundum, which means against the world. Because when his
Okay.
disciple asked him, he's like, yeah, if the whole world is against me, I am against the world, for I live in the world, but not made of the same fabric of the world.
Yeah.
Of course, borrowing from Jesus' words. But yeah, I felt like, okay, if my entire family and social circle is trying to convince me to go back to Christianity, and they think that I wrote that I read a couple of books that messed with my head, if the whole world is against me, then I will have to stand my feet against the world, but now as an atheist, not as a believer anymore. So it was a very ironic phase of my life.
Yeah. Well, my parents still think I'm going to come back to the faith. I'm like, not going to happen. I know the history. I know it inside and out, backwards and forwards. There's no way I could be a Christian without like doing a complete, brain atrophy of all the information and history that I know. So it'd be impossible. So,
Still, Jesus loves you.
and it's funny, like, you have started, but Bart Ehrman did, I think it was within the last year, Ehrman had a podcast where he had a guest on who was one of his colleagues who knows all the same New Testament scholarship that Ehrman knows, but who's still a practicing Christian. So it is kind of funny that you can still know all the history and still believe it. I don't really get it. It doesn't make any sense to me that you can know the history and still believe it, knowing how much of it they made up. So
Yeah, I had an incident when I was doing my degree, and I was doing this subject on the historical Jesus. And of course, at that time, I was still bitter and trying to find my feet, and I was asking the harshest questions in the lecture room. I was the naughty student in the class. But I remember one day my professor pulled me aside, and he was a Christian professor teaching this subject. And despite the academic nature and approach, and you're not supposed to be a believer inside the university walls, but he pulled me aside and he said, I want to ask you a question. Why do I feel like you have a personal problem with Jesus Christ? And I was taken back by that question, because are you asking me as my professor, or it sounded like a pastor? Later on, I knew that he was a pastor, by the way, but I didn't know at the time. And I said, well, clearly I joined the course because I have problems with my own faith, and I came here to investigate this. And more I'm finding that there is no substance to it. It's like, no, it's you. And it was a very interesting conversation, but I still don't understand how people can know what they know about the New Testament and be academic in that sphere,
yeah.
and they still hold their beliefs.
But it's not unusual. I mean, like what you went through is the same thing that Bart Ehrman went through, the same thing many others have gone through, that they've done the work and come out the other side and said, I just don't believe this anymore. So it's not unusual that you went through that. I'm surprised that your professor, was shocked by that. You would think he would expect something like that. Yeah. So like there's that famous, it was a famous gaffe by the American Senator Rick Santorum, who was running for president like 10, 15 years ago. And he made some stupid comment about, you send your children off to university and they come back as atheists. I'm like, yeah, that's what university's for, is to teach you critical thinking. So if you're afraid to send your kid to university because they're going to think, all right.
I'll take this as a compliment. That's why you should send your kids to universities.
Yeah. So what in your studies, like was there something that particularly intrigued you, like a topic or a subject that really grabbed your attention, that really interested you?
Historical Jesus was definitely one. But I also enjoyed any subject which wasn't, so the focus of my study was mostly on the New Testament, but I did a few electives on the Old Testament. And I was very intrigued and interested in the subjects that I studied in the Old Testament, because they were taught to us by Jewish rabbis, again, professors, academics. But it added a very interesting perspective. I never learned about the Old Testament from the Jewish perspective. It was always the Christian perspective,
Right.
and of
And
course read the
there's major problems with that. So
100%. So
yeah.
it's fascinating when you read the Old Testament as a Christian and you see Jesus all over the Old Testament, right? But then you finally come to see it from the Jewish perspective, and really from a critical thinking. If you put the critical thinker glasses on, you see completely different text. So yes, the Old Testament was fantastic. The books of wisdom, it was fascinating.
Yeah, there's a great quote. The American comedian Lewis Black, from his stand-up, Red, White, and Screwed. He's talking about how, like, every Sunday you turn on the TV and there's a pastor interpreting the Old Testament and getting it wrong. And then his best line is, "You never see a rabbi on television interpreting the New Testament, do you?" And it's true. Like, that's one of the reasons why. So John Collins, the professor from Yale, who was on the show, about a year or two ago, he was very helpful to me as well in my own research. So I reached out to him. It's probably about 2019. I was doing an update to my first book, and I wanted to investigate a little more the messianic passages from the Jewish perspective. We know what the Christians say are the messianic passages, which clearly are not, and the Jews do not interpret them to be messianic. So I emailed John and I said, "Hey, so if you Google search, you can't find anything. It just comes up with all the Christian references on Google." So I emailed John, who is the Holmes Professor of Old Testament Criticism at Yale, or he's retired now, to say, "Hey, so what are the actual passages that the Jews consider to be messianic, not the Christian ones?" And so he actually sent me a copy of his book, The Scepter and the Star, that does deconstruct what those passages are. And they're mainly around the initial post-exile community that's come back from the Babylonian captivity, like Ezra. They've come back, they're building just the very beginnings of the Second Temple era. That is about the only time you have any. There's like two books. I think it's like, as in Ezra and Nehemiah. Maybe there's another book, maybe not Ezra, but there's only like these two books that have any sort of messianic expectations, and it all revolves around Zerubbabel, who is the exilarch, the patriarch in exile. So, and he doesn't want to be the king, and then so basically the messianic expectations just die off, and they come up. Zerubbabel declines to be the Messiah, and it just kind of goes dormant for like 300-400 years until it gets resurrected during the Maccabean revolt, when they see their culture being threatened. So it's quite interesting where these messianic passages are and what they're actually referring to. And again, the political context is so important. You cannot just read it on the surface. This is one of my problems with Bible study. To me, church Bible study is not study, it's regurgitation. These people are not textually deconstructing what is going on politically, geopolitically at the time that is related to what these passages are talking about. So something like, having that understanding of, the exilarch comes back from Babylon after Cyrus the Great frees the Jews, and doesn't want to be the king, and it goes dormant, and then again resurrects. But why does it resurrect? What's going on geopolitically that causes these beliefs to come back? So yeah, it is quite fascinating. But and this is why I don't like Bible study, because there's no actual study going on. These people are in an echo chamber. It's a bubble. So
Yeah, absolutely. One analogy I used in one of my videos on YouTube, I tried to explain this, the Bible studies and how Christians look at the Old Testament. Basically, I'm not sure if you heard that story before, but it's a story that has nothing to do with the Bible. It's about an ancient king walking down the forest with his soldiers, and as he's just going around, he found a number of arrows hit precisely on trees in the bullseye, in the dead center of every target. And he goes, "Whoever threw these arrows is a very accurate archer, and I want him on my army. Go and find this man for me." So the soldiers go and find this man who threw these arrows in the forest. They bring him to the king, and he's like, "Who taught you to throw your arrows with such dead accuracy?" And it's like, "I don't. You're Your Majesty, I don't even know how to throw arrows. What I basically do is I throw random arrows, and whichever one hit a tree, I go and draw a circle around the arrow. And that's exactly, if you think about it, from the Christian, but what they do is they just go all over the Old Testament. They found random arrows and random verses, and they perfectly draw a circle around the arrow. The virgin birth, the Psalm 22, all these things are really circle drawn around the arrow. It was never an arrow as a prophecy about Jesus to start with. And given the political and
the other issue that I try to drive home to people, and Bart Ehrman did it about a year ago. Dermot McCulloch does it in his book Christianity. So both McCulloch and Ehrman have made the point, and I've tried to reiterate it. Prophecy, in its original context, does not mean predicting the future. It means interpreting the divine will right now. Something's happening. There's been an earthquake, or there's an army on our border. Something is happening. Prophecy is determining what is going. Is God punishing us? Like this army that's on our border, is God punishing us because we haven't held the law strictly enough? That's what prophecy is. It is not about predicting something that's going to happen in 800 years. It's understanding in a contemporary fashion what's going on right now. That what is God doing? So
I love that. Yeah, that's spot on. And I wish more believers know this very fact.
So, and I've tried to investigate it because I'd like to know, and it could actually maybe be an interesting, like a master's thesis. When did prophecy take on this connotation of the future, and when did scholars kind of rediscover the roots, or did the scholars always kind of know and were always going, hey, but everybody ignored them? So I'm kind of curious to know when prophecy takes on this sheen of fortune telling. So, but I haven't been able to find the answer, and the professors that I've asked don't know either. So, but I'm sure there's some esoteric scholar out there who knows this, but I don't know who it is.
If I put my amateur interpretation on, I think it started. So from very old time, the Jews have been waiting for this messianic figure, right? That's the only thing that is kind of futuristic. Other than that, as you said, prophecy has always been about interpreting reality in the here and now. But then comes Christianity with this idea of, well, we got the Messiah, what from here? They shifted the focus from what's happening here and now, and what should we expect in the next 20, 30, 60 years from now? The end is near, the prominent ending, and the end of evil and all that jazz. So Christianity, I think, is the morphing piece towards prophecy. Is not just about interpreting here and now. It's about interpreting the next 100 years from now, where Jesus will come back and everyone will be saved. And then comes Islam and takes it to another level. It becomes about the 500 years later or 1,000 years later. Again, I don't think that was the original context of Islam, but believers, as we go far in time away from the original text, we are forced in a way to take that projection way far in the future because it's relevant to us now. The text is ancient, so you got to take the interpretation to the future.
Yeah, I would concur with your analysis. I was kind of leaning the same way myself, that it's probably the early Christians who they see the return delayed, and so they settle in for the long haul, and that's probably when prophecy takes on this aura of future projections rather than contemporary. So I think you're probably accurate in that assessment. So it is, yeah. You said something else there, but it's like I wanted to touch on it, but now I can't remember exactly what it was. So yeah. I mean, there's so much.
The fact that
there's just
the more time gap we have between us and the text, you are forced to take the text into future projection, because that future projection is us in the here and now, and the text becomes ancient. So you're forced to see the text in the light of how it is relevant to you now. So the prophecy then becomes more of a future projection rather than taken in its day and time when it was written.
Yeah, yeah, that's what I was going to mention. So when we talk about like the messianic prophecies, they resurrect during that's a good word, because it actually, the resurrection occurs in the book of Daniel, written during the Maccabean revolt. So the messianic ideas not only resurrected, they evolve. So it goes from being, so the Messiah was just supposed to be a warrior king who's going to free them from foreign domination and free the Jewish people and let them live their own lives. It evolves during the Maccabean revolt into a, what's the word? How does Collins describe it? I want to say the angelic Messiah, but that's probably wrong. But anyway, in Daniel chapter 12, it mentions the archangel Michael, and it mentions earlier, like in Daniel 7, it mentions the Son of Man, and then it says, at that time, in Daniel 12, it says, at that time, Michael shall stand up. So Collins is theorizing that Michael is the Son of Man, mentioned, like I think in chapter 7. Michael will stand up. That's the beginning of the kingdom that Jesus is prophesying. And so both, that was the other thing I was going to, so you mentioned Islam as well. So Jesus is preaching an apocalyptic message. Some scholars also theorize that Islam was also apocalyptic, that they believed that the world was about to end and God was coming back. Part of that, I believe there was a major flood that killed a lot of people, like a dam collapsed or something in southern Saudi, and it was a major catastrophe. A lot of people died, and it was kind of seen as an omen of the end times. So both Judaism during the Maccabean revolt and Christianity after Jesus fails to return, they both kind of evolve into this long term where the messianic kingdom, instead of being here on earth, becomes the afterlife, right? So the Jews think they're going to go to heaven, the Christians think they're going to go to heaven, then along come the Muslims and pick it up from the Christians and the Jews. That this idea that the messianic kingdom, maybe because it's not manifesting here, maybe we've been wrong all of this time, and it shifts and it becomes, the messianic kingdom we get in heaven when we die, if we live a good and righteous life. And if we don't, what do we do with the people who haven't been righteous Jews? We got to think of, what are we going to do with them, right? So
absolutely, yeah. There's even a school of thought around Islam that people say that Muhammad is not the real name of the prophet. Some people think that it was a title as the Blessed, which is kind of a reference to a messianic figure.
Yeah, there's an American scholar, I can't remember his name, and he was suggesting that like Muhammad means like committee, like that, this is a team of scholars who are writing this. And I asked another very prominent scholar, I think he's at Georgetown University, I can't remember his name up to my head, and he's like, I've never heard that theory before. So but yeah, it is interesting. So, but I mean, you obviously weren't a Muslim, but you lived in a Muslim country, so you obviously have had exposure to Islam and the Quran. Like when you're a Coptic Christian growing up in Egypt, I presume you're attending a public school with 90% Muslim kids, and you're probably getting some Islamic teaching in classes, or you're in your own school.
Yes and no. So I was lucky in the sense that I went to a Catholic school, not to a public school.
Okay.
But even though it's actually forced on you in the curriculum, the only way to study Arabic in school, whether you are in a private Catholic school or you're in a public school, the way to study Arabic as a subject is by studying the Quran, the grammar of the Quran, and you have to memorize chunks of it. Think about it as when you study English as a subject. You have to study English literature. You have to study Shakespeare and Charles Dickens and memorize some poems. It's exactly the same thing in Arabic. So yes, from a very young age, in order to study Arabic as a subject, you really get great exposure to Islamic texts, and you have to memorize the Quran regardless of your personal faith. I can be a Christian, but I knew how to recite Quran, or at least parts of it, not all of it. So yeah.
And they're hoping, are the powers that be hoping that forcing the Christians to study the Quran, that they'll convert? Or they're worried you guys are going to start taking it apart and criticizing?
Maybe, who knows? But there is definitely that element there. And And it's an interesting thing in any school, even if you go to a Christian school in Egypt, always the teacher who teaches Arabic has to be Muslim. So it's and any Christian school in Egypt, by law, they have to accept, I think, at least 10% or 15% of Muslim students.
So, okay, so
and
the Christian schools have to admit 15% Muslim students.
by law, yes. And the
Really?
Catholic
Why? So
school has to provide
what's
Islam. Sorry, and the Catholic school has to provide Islamic. So whenever we had the what do you call it, the period or the subject of studying religion, the class will split in two. Those who are Christian will go with a teacher to study about their Christian faith, and Muslim kids, which is about 15%, they will have to go with a Muslim teacher teaching them about Islam. So even though it's a Catholic school, it has to teach their student about Islam.
So what's the point of this law that would force Christian schools to have so many Muslim students? I don't see the logic behind making a law like that.
I think because, at least at the time when I was growing up, most of the reputable reputable private schools were Christian schools, whether that was the Jesuit or the Catholic schools. So they were always Christian. So from that perspective, Muslim kids wouldn't have a chance or equal opportunity towards private schools and higher education.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
All right,
these
that makes
schools,
sense. Okay.
in order to be licensed and exist, they have to accept a certain percentage of Muslim kids.
Got it. Okay, so what was it like being a Coptic Christian going to a Catholic school? Like, were they shoving Catholic doctrine down your throats and telling you have to
No.
believe this over your Coptic heresy?
in Egypt, funny enough, because Christianity is a minority anyway, you wouldn't find much of a conflict between Catholicism and Orthodoxy. They're kind of almost
It's like
the majority
kinda
of
like
people
your
don't even know the
allies.
difference. Yeah, exactly.
You have to
Allies.
ally and be strong together. Okay.
Yeah, the only outstander in this context would be the Protestants. So I remember growing up in my church, it was a massive debate. You're not allowed to go to a Protestant church, but you can go to a Catholic one. Just don't have communion there. But Protestant, they are from the devil. Like, don't go to a Protestant. It's such a
Really?
clear distinction. Yeah. So it's a very, very funny thing. To the
I would
extent that
imagine I would imagine Protestants in Egypt are very few and far between. I would think, there have to be a very, very tiny minority, like probably not even 1% of the population.
they are growing, and to be honest, they're
Yeah.
also very active in their preaching and activities, and they're more modern, more
that-
liberal than the
Isn't that kind of
Orthodox Church.
dangerous? Isn't that kind of dangerous in a Muslim country to be like actively proselytizing?
Well, within their walls, it's not like they
Right.
go out and preach to Muslims, but they are very active and they are very attractive in a way to attract the Orthodox youth specifically,
Okay.
coming from a very rigid, old school thinking to a modern church. Think of Hillsong kind of thing, like very, very cool and modern. They're very attractive, and that's why the Orthodox Church then says if you go to a Protestant church, you are forbidden from having Holy Communion and attending church services. It's such a stupid game. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. It is. Yeah. Okay. I wrote a section. So I've written a book on the history of the Catholic Church. I've just finished it, and now I'm editing and adding some more content. And the book is chronological. So obviously we had Vatican II in the 1960s. So right near the end of the book is an analysis of the council documents that were released, at least the ones that relate to how we relate in the modern world. The internal church stuff, I don't care about. But they did have like their decree on ecumenism, which is basically the unity of the entire Christian church. And one of the things I pointed out in my analysis is, yeah, it's unity with the Christian faith, but as long as you're paying lip service that the Pope is the head of all churches, and in one of there was a document Francis issued, I think maybe 2019. I can't remember. This is why it's all in the book. I can't remember all this stuff. Somewhere around 2019, Francis issued an update to this ecumenical proclamation of Vatican II. And I did a keyword search on it, and like, the word Catholic shows up like 80 freaking times, in this document that's supposed to be about universal Christian brotherhood. So it's like, yeah, whatever. That's what that's why I was thinking, like, the Catholic Church in Egypt is probably pushing their narrative, but as you said, they're a minority, so they kind of have to stand strong together. But so these Protestants, are they mainly evangelical churches there that very much like that
Yeah.
that spirited sort of sermons that they have, like you mentioned Hillsong. So okay,
Yeah,
yeah,
mostly the Anglican. They're Anglican.
okay.
Yeah.
I wouldn't really consider Anglicans to be evangelicals, though. There may be
Really?
a strain of evangelical. The evangelicals tend to be like the Baptists and the Presbyterians, not so much the
All right,
Anglicans.
these are really, like, you count them on one hand, kind of. They do exist, and you even have Jehovah's Witness, like the very outcast kind of Christian sects. They are very few in numbers, but I thought, okay, I confused evangelical and Anglican because in Arabic it's almost the same word.
Okay. So yeah, you haven't. The Anglicans are the ones who are growing in Egypt.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. And that's probably a result of the British, when the British controls Egypt, right? Because the Anglican Church.
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, the history is pretty cool. So like I remember like being a kid, and driving through like a nearby city that had a Coptic church. I don't think my city had a Coptic population, but we drove through like a nearby town that had a Coptic church, and I remember asking like, what is this? I mean, who are these heretics?
Yep.
Yeah.
They're very similar
Yeah.
to Greek Orthodox. For those who don't know much about the Coptics, it's almost 99% Greek Orthodox.
Yeah, and that's their title, or the Oriental Orthodox churches. So interestingly enough, it was these Eastern churches, and this is sort of an area of study that I've in the last couple of weeks really getting into, because the editing I'm doing right now, the section I'm re-editing is around, around like the year like 950 to like 1250, 1300, when the Islamic scholarship from the Islamic Golden Age in Spain, in Andalusia, when this starts getting translated into Latin and percolating back up into Europe. And it's quite a fascinating era, this spirit of collegiality that you have between the Muslim scholars, the Jewish scholars, the Christian scholars, all working together to translate this. And it's quite an interesting period of history that I'm really getting into.
Yeah.
And it's these Eastern Christians, these Oriental Orthodox, the Church of the East. They're the ones who translate the ancient Greek, like Aristotle, and all of they translated for the House of Wisdom in Baghdad, but they also translate like the Christian documents from the Council for their own debates, and so they're the ones who preserve the knowledge of classical antiquity that then gets rediscovered in Andalusia, like around the turn of the first millennium, when they discover all of this ancient Greek knowledge that's been preserved by the Eastern Christians for the House of Wisdom in Baghdad, that then gets translated because the Muslims know the secret of paper, and so they can disseminate
Right.
knowledge. Yeah. So
This is an era that I am very illiterate about. Like I don't have much knowledge about this particular phase.
yeah,
It's very
no,
fascinating.
it is a really interesting part of history. So the section I'm doing right now is like focused right around like the late 900s, when some of the first Catholic scholars are in Spain and translating Al-Khwarizmi's algebra and his star tables, Euclid. This is just sort of at the beginning when it's percolating back, and it's such a fascinating time. And to think, like, there was these Eastern Christians, who had preserved all of this knowledge, as part of their doctrinal debates with the Roman imperial Christians, and then obviously the Abbasid Caliphate wants this knowledge for their library as well. So it's a cool era. So
Yeah.
yeah, well, it's been about an hour, so we should probably wrap it up. Any parting thoughts you'd like to share?
No, it has been such an interesting, very easygoing conversation. I really appreciate the chat, and yeah, if you, I'm not sure if you have or not, but have a look at my English speaking YouTube channel and feel free to reach out and let me know if we can collaborate on my channel at some point. That would be fantastic.
Sure. Yeah, appreciate it. So for our viewers, look in the description. You'll find his channel, and you said you wrote a book as well. So send me the link for your book, and we'll put the book and a link to your channel in the description where people can find it. If you are someone, if you like, as Adam mentioned, if you're going through this sort of alone right now, maybe check out his channel. Maybe there's some videos there that can help you on your journey to free thought from whatever religious tradition you might be in. So. Well, appreciate it. I mean, it has been fun. Like you studied biblical studies. I haven't done it formally, but I do it. I've been doing it for over 10 years as my own personal interest to write. So we obviously have sort of the same scholarly background into religion. So it makes for an interesting conversation. So thanks for your time. And again, thank you for your efforts. And we'll direct people to come check out your channel and see there's some videos there that are helpful to them. So thanks for coming on. We'd like to remind everybody, please hit that like and subscribe button. Do check out our other videos of past guests, and we will see everybody next time. Take care and bye-bye.
Okay, thanks for listening, and don't forget we're on YouTube, so follow us on YouTube. Just search for Atheist Alliance International, and please subscribe and hit that notification bell. We're also on all of your favourite podcast platforms, so make sure that you follow us on there as well. See you next time.